Hello? I'm Lemuel Beach. I built the house my family now calls theirs, but somehow I became the guest. They said I was forgetful, that I needed less responsibility. Then they emptied my accounts, locked my workshop, and listed my home for sale without telling me. One night, over a candlelit dinner, they called a fresh start. They handed me a future I didn't choose, a care home, a goodbye disguised as love. But I didn't leave quietly. I left with the truth in my pocket, and a recorder that never forgot what they hoped I would. What do you do when your family decides your life is no longer yours to live? I didn't answer Ellie's message right away. Grandpa, do you mind if I use your workshop for my baking channel setup? Just like that, like I was a tenant and not the man who poured the foundation of this house with my own hands. I stared at the text for a long while, the blue glow from my phone illuminating the framed photo of Elizabeth by the nightstand. Her smile still held warmth, even in stillness. I slid the phone face down and leaned back, trying to remember when this house had last felt like mine. A month earlier, Jory and Charla had shown up with their SUV stuffed to the brim. Boxes labeled minimalist decor, office tech, and guest bedroom redesign were the first things I noticed. I'd been told it would be temporary, just until they got back on their feet after Charla's consulting firm laid off half its staff. Jory said it like I was lucky to have company again. I tried to believe that. They hugged me, smiled like nothing had changed, and maybe nothing had for them. I told myself I was glad for the company, even though I'd grown used to the quiet. But the moment Charla walked in and started rearranging the bookshelf, moving my first edition Mark Twain to make room for a soy candle and an acrylic sculpture, I felt something else settle in my chest. Not sadness, something quieter, like dust. 2 days later, I came into the living room and saw it, the large framed portrait of Elizabeth and me at the dedication of Beechford Bridge. Gone. In its place was a sleek digital screen flashing through photos of Jory, Charla, and Ellie at various wineries and amusement parks. I stood there for several seconds, the silence pressing hard in my ears. "Oh, I updated the space," Charla said without looking up from her tablet. "That big frame didn't really match the modern aesthetic. This one cycles pictures so much more dynamic." I didn't argue. I nodded, walked to the hallway closet, and tucked the old photo inside a thick blanket where it wouldn't warp. I didn't tell her that Elizabeth had picked that frame herself or that it had hung in the same spot for nearly 25 years. No. I just folded the blanket tighter around it. Maybe this house wasn't just being redecorated. Maybe I was being packed up, too. Our first dinner together after they'd moved in was quiet, and not in a comforting way. The kitchen smelled like sautéed kale and lemon zest. I sat at my usual spot and realized no one had asked what I wanted to eat. In front of me sat a plate of quinoa, kale, and something called tahini. Elizabeth used to make mashed potatoes on cold nights, simple, buttery, with just enough pepper. This wasn't that. Ellie barely looked up from her phone, tapping out what I assumed was some social post. "This is actually really nutrient-dense," Charla said, as if it were an apology or a sales pitch. "Sure," I muttered, and chewed. The food was fine. The silence was not. Later that week, I walked down the hallway toward my old storage room. It used to be where I kept design sketches, hand tools, and photo albums. Now, the door was wide open, and Jory was pulling down shelves. "Hey, Dad," he said. "We were thinking this could be a good spot for our shared office. Charla has client calls all day, and it's kind of cramped in the bedroom." He didn't ask. He stated, and I nodded. That night, I pulled on my coat and went to sit under the apple tree out back. The ground was cold. My knees ached. But I sat there anyway. watching the house I'd built brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck glow from the inside with a light that no longer felt like mine. Elizabeth had once told me that a home remembers its builder. I used to believe that. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I went into the garage to find my toolbox. I needed pliers to fix the loose hinge on the screen door. Instead, I found cardboard boxes stacked high, my rocking chair shoved behind them like clutter. I dug around and found a bag labeled "Donate." Inside were Elizabeth's old gardening gloves, soft leather, worn at the fingertips, still smelling faintly of thyme. I held them in my hand longer than I meant to. You don't always notice when you've been replaced. Sometimes, it starts with a framed photo and ends with your memories boxed away. The morning started like most others, quiet, dim, and still. I'd woken before the sun, the way I always did. My bones knew the hour better than any alarm clock. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the day, except for one quiet fact: it was my birthday. I hadn't mentioned it. No one had asked. But I remembered. Elizabeth used to leave little notes taped to the bathroom mirror. One year she recorded a cassette of her humming happy birthday and slipped it into the player before she left for work. When I pressed play that morning, her voice crackled through the static, soft and off-key and perfect. I smiled, then not because of the song, but because she knew me. She always did. Today, there were no notes, no humming, just the brittle creak of old floorboards beneath my slippers as I padded down the hallway. I didn't expect a celebration, not at my age, but I had hoped for something small: recognition. Perhaps a card, a slice of lemon pie, or even just a look that said, "We didn't forget." Downstairs, the kitchen felt cold, though the thermostat read 70. Ellie's baking supplies were sprawled across the table: sprinkles, piping bags, a ring light half folded and glowing faint blue. The fridge hummed, louder than usual. I stood for a moment, looking at the clutter like a guest who'd arrived early to a party that wasn't his. Jory brushed past me in the hallway. "Hey, Dad," he muttered, eyes on his phone, fingers moving fast. I turned, opened my mouth to speak, but he'd already moved on, disappearing into the back room he now called his workspace. I opened the fridge, 2 clear plastic containers of kale salad, a bottle of green juice, no cake, no pie, no card. I sat down at the far end of the table, away from the tripod. The chair was unfamiliar. It had replaced the one Elizabeth used to favor. The silence pressed in again. Heavier now. I chewed at nothing and stood up again, aimless. By midday, a notification lit up my phone. A text from Ellie: "Did food get there? Sorry, we're slammed with meetings. Love ya." I stepped out and opened the front door. A small delivery bag sat on the porch, brown paper, slightly damp at the bottom. I carried it inside, careful not to spill whatever lay within. Inside was a salad, same kind. A tiny cupcake, white frosting barely holding its shape. No candle, just there. Not even a napkin. I set the bag down and sat at the counter. Slowly, methodically. I unwrapped the plastic, peeled back the layers like I was uncovering something sacred. But nothing felt sacred. The salad was bland. The cupcake sat untouched. I chewed, swallowed, thought about that cassette tape again. The way Elizabeth had smiled when I replayed it that evening. "Next year, I'll sing it live," she joked. The silence now tasted stronger than the salad. I placed the cupcake back in its wrapper and pushed the plate away. There wasn't a single word spoken to me all day that acknowledged I'd survived another year. Maybe they didn't forget. Maybe they just didn't remember. In the afternoon, I stepped out into the backyard. The wind was brisk, but bearable. I stood for a while near the apple tree, its branches still bare, and let the breeze pass through me. When I returned to the house, I walked toward my workshop, the place where I kept old designs, where I tinkered with broken lamps, rewired radios, fixed things. The doorknob didn't turn. I tried again. It was locked. I knocked once, instinctively. No answer. They hadn't just forgotten my birthday. They had locked me out of the one place that still felt like mine. Later that evening, I searched through the hallway closet. I was looking for the photo album Elizabeth had made, the one with the silver binding, filled with Polaroids from our first road trip to the Smokies. It wasn't there. Instead, I found a plastic bin with a masking tape label, MISC, Donate. I opened it. A pair of mittens sat on top, faded green, lined with fleece, Elizabeth's. I recognized the tiny patch she'd stitched near the thumb, where they tore one winter during a snowball fight with Jory. I sat down in the hallway with the mittens in my hands. I wasn't angry. I was missing, and no one seemed to notice. The envelope still sat on my dresser when I woke. I hadn't decided what to do, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. That morning, I shuffled toward the hallway closet to retrieve some old tax files. Elizabeth used to organize everything neatly by year. I remembered the blue folder from 2014, the one with our final joint return, but the doorknob wouldn't turn. I jiggled it, then tried my skeleton key. Nothing. I mentioned it later over lunch. Did someone lock the closet near the laundry room? Charla didn't look up from her salad. Oh, that. I locked it for your safety. Dad, my safety. You've been misplacing things lately. We found your flashlight in the freezer last week. That was Ellie, I corrected. Not sharply, just steady. Well, either way, it's just better to keep things safe. We don't want you tripping again. She said it like a lullaby, sweet and flat. It was the second time they'd brought up forgetting. The first was when Jory said I'd left the stove on though I hadn't cooked in weeks. That time, I brushed it off. This time, I didn't. Later that day, I stopped by the pharmacy to pick up my blood pressure refill. The girl behind the counter was new soft voice, hair tied back with a blue scrunchie. As she rang me up, her screen pinged. Oh, Charla Wepner. This is about Mr. Beach's new dosage. She had her phone on speaker. Charla's voice came through, calm as ever. Yes, just confirming the memory stabilizers were approved. He's on them now, right? I didn't say a word. The girl looked up, startled. I signed the receipt with hands I tried to keep steady. My full name, in clear block letters. The pen wobbled slightly, but I didn't ask for help. Walking back to my truck, the wind stung more than it should have. I sat in the driver's seat longer than needed, trying to remember if I'd missed any pills. There were no memory stabilizers, not that I knew of. That weekend, I took to the garden. The soil was still cool, but workable. I loosened it near the fence, where Elizabeth's lavender once thrived. That's when I heard Mr. Clove next door. Lemuel, he said, nodding toward me over the hedge. Good weather for turning the soil. Sure is. He looked at the house, then back at me. Listen, I probably shouldn't say anything, but some folks said you might be moving into Ridgeview soon. You okay? Ridgeview, I wipe my hands on my jeans. That's the senior facility outside town. Yeah, well, just neighborhood talk, he said quickly. I'm sure it's nothing. I nodded, but something in my gut pulled tight. Neighborhood talk didn't just invent itself. Someone had said something, maybe more than once. That evening at dinner, I tried again. Jory, I said, we need to talk about what Charla told the pharmacist. He looked up from his plate, chewing. What about it? I'm not on memory medication. Never agreed to any. Yet, apparently, someone thinks I am. Charla spoke before Jory could. You've just seemed off lately. Dad, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Your mother had memory issues too. Remember? I stared at my son. Don't gaslight me. The word stopped him. He blinked, opened his mouth, then closed it again. I remember plenty. I remember building this house before you were born. I remember teaching you to change the oil. I remember holding your hand when you cried over your first broken bone. Ellie stood, grabbing her plate. I have homework, she muttered, walking out. The rest of the meal passed in silence, except for the clink of forks on ceramic. The next morning, I took a walk to clear my mind. I passed the church where Elizabeth once taught Sunday school. Its steeple cast a long shadow over the sidewalk. I kept walking until I found myself back at the backyard flower beds. I knelt and began digging not deep, not to plant anything, but to feel the earth, to remind myself I could still do something with my hands that wasn't being second-guessed. They think I'm forgetting, but I haven't forgotten how to see what's being hidden. I haven't forgotten what belongs to me. I pressed my palms into the soil, then wiped them clean and returned to the house. That night, I tucked a small recorder into the lining of my coat. Nothing fancy, just something to catch words as they came. Time to start keeping track. Time to protect my own memory not from loss, but from theft. Around midnight, I heard the soft scratch of paper near my door. I waited until the footsteps faded. Then I stood and opened it. An envelope, unmarked. Inside a printed thread of emails. Subject line Dad Dementia Planning. That line ghost of my grandpa echoed all through the night. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I moved through the house while it was still quiet, checking every drawer, every cabinet, even the underside of cushions where I used to hide loose change and spare keys. The envelope from the night before was folded tightly in my pocket, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been. I needed to find the home deed, the will drafts, anything that still had my name inked clearly at the top. When I reached the hallway closet, I found nothing. The folders had vanished. The metal box with Elizabeth's birth certificate, the insurance documents I'd kept it on the top shelf since 1991, gone. At breakfast, I didn't wait for the usual pleasantries. Jory, I asked plainly, where are the house deeds? He looked up from his mug, blinking like he didn't hear me right. I don't know. Charla was reorganizing some things last week. She might have moved them where I don't know. Dad, he shrugged. We'll look together later. But we didn't. That afternoon, I headed for the workshop, thinking maybe some of the documents had been stashed in there. The door, once wood and brass, now had a sleek digital keypad mounted above the handle. I stared at it, stunned. I pressed the knob out of habit. Nothing. Charla's voice floated down the hallway. We needed a more private space for Zoom meetings. I turned. This is my workshop. You weren't really using it. Dad, that room held your mother's wedding dress. Charla hesitated just a beat, then said, we boxed everything, probably in storage. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded. But inside, something tilted. After dinner, I walked to the garage. A thin layer of dust had started collecting on the edges of shelves and boxes, as if the house itself was grieving. I found a bin labeled guest room closets, inside an old rust-stained lunchbox I once used at the plant, a half-knitted scarf Elizabeth never finished, and 2 worn gardening gloves folded neatly beside an envelope. The envelope had my name written in blue ink, Elizabeth's handwriting. It was dated March 1973. I sat down right there on the concrete and opened it. Lem, it began. If you're reading this, it's probably because I forgot to give it to you on your birthday. Again, I wanted to say thank you for building this life with me, for always fixing the sink before I had to ask, for letting me hum too loud at night. I stopped reading. My hands trembled, not from age, but from everything that letter still held. I pressed it to my chest and stayed like that for a long time. Later that evening, we ate in silence. The only sound was Ellie tapping on her phone. Jory talked about refinancing. Charla scrolled through emails on her tablet. I looked up and said, "When were you planning to tell me I'm no longer listed as the emergency contact on the home insurance?" The room went still. Charla answered, calm and polished. "You seemed stressed. We wanted to lighten your load." "You're not lightening it," I said, voice firm. "You're cutting me out of it." No one responded. That night, I sat at my desk. The gloves and letter rested beside me like artifacts from a life someone else was trying to rewrite. I picked up my pen and opened a fresh notebook. I tried to write a full entry, but all I could put down was one line. If I disappear one day, check the bins in the garage. Then I folded the gloves tighter, tucked them into my coat pocket. Later, I passed the workshop on my way to bed. The light was on inside. I paused, leaned closer. Through the door, I heard Ellie's voice. "This is where the ghost of my grandpa still lingers, kinda spooky, right? I didn't sleep the night I got that letter." I sat in the kitchen with a yellow legal pad, scribbling down every transaction I could remember, dates, names, what I thought I'd authorized and what I knew I hadn't. By sunrise, I had 3 pages of notes and a headache that settled behind my eyes like fog. I made coffee, poured it into the old chipped mug Elizabeth used to favor, and opened my bank app again. The numbers stared back too clean, too vague. Tech camp, culinary course, educational resources. I hadn't signed off on a dime of it. I dialed the bank, gave my password, and waited. "Yes, Mr. Beach," the woman said politely. "These withdrawals were authorized under the power of attorney on file. That would be Mrs. Charla Beach." I didn't respond at first, just stared at the calendar on the fridge, where someone, probably Ellie, had drawn smiley faces over April weekends. "Would you like to dispute the charges?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Yes, I would." That evening, we gathered at the table like we always did, except nothing about it felt ordinary. Charla had made spaghetti squash and some kind of cashew cream sauce. Ellie was already on her phone, thumb flicking faster than thought. I took a breath. I'd like to talk about the $3,000 missing from my account. The room froze. Charla blinked once, then smiled as if she'd rehearsed it. "We're investing in Ellie's future," she said. "You've always said you believe in education." I looked at Ellie. She didn't look up. "Belief requires consent," I said. This was theft disguised as faith. Jory cleared his throat. "Dad, don't." I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The next morning, I went to the town clerk's office, brought an old copy of the house deed I'd kept folded inside a Bible since 1986. The clerk, a man with a trim mustache and the kind of voice that softened bad news, pulled up the record. "There's a supplemental authorization form," he said. "Filed last month." I didn't sign anything last month. It was emailed in. The signature looked scanned, not handwritten. I didn't argue. Just nodded and walked out with a printed copy in my coat pocket. Back home, I called another family dinner. Jory asked if something was wrong. Charla looked amused. Ellie didn't come down. "I want to see the documents you used to access my accounts," I said. Charla tilted her head. "Why the suspicion?" "We're your family," family asks. I replied, Thieves' act. Her lips curled slightly. Well, that's dramatic. I didn't answer. Later, after everyone had scattered, I heard laughter from upstairs. The hallway lights buzzed, dimmed, then steadied. I stood in the doorway to my room, trying to steady my breath. "You're not the man you used to be." "Dad," Charla had said at dinner. Maybe that's the issue. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I opened my drawer, found the recorder I'd hidden. I pressed record, leaned close. "My name is Lemuel Beach," I said quietly, "and I am not crazy. Not yet." That night, I walked out to the mailbox to clear my head. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside was another letter, this one from the insurance company. Owner authorization updated. It read, "Effective immediately. By dawn." I had already changed every password and called Rudy again. It was time. I pulled my coat close and headed straight to City Hall. The clerk at the property records window was New Young, polite, with fingers that danced over a keyboard like he was born doing it. "I'd like to see the most recent filings for 1227 Crenshaw Lane," I said. He typed, clicked, squinted. "Okay, 2 weeks ago. There was a residential address update filed." My stomach dropped. "And who filed it?" He paused. "It was submitted digitally. The form has your signature on it." "Sir? Matched to the file? It wasn't me?" He blinked. "Would you like a printed copy?" I nodded, and when the paper landed in my hand, it smelled faintly of toner. The signature looked close, but not close enough. Not for someone who's written his name the same way for nearly 8 decades. I folded it twice, slipped it into my jacket, and walked straight to the clinic. Dr. Mathers had been my physician for 23 years. He delivered Ellie. He stitched my shoulder when I tore it lifting shingles in '02. "Lem," he said, ushering me into the exam room. "You all right?" "No," I said plainly. "Check my file." He sat, clicked, then frowned. "There's a note in here from last month. Patient exhibiting cognitive decline. Consider guardianship options." I watched him closely. "You write that?" He shook his head. "Absolutely not. It's not signed. No initials. Just a system flag. That's not how I chart. Lem." We sat in silence. "They're preparing something," I said, "and they're using your name to do it. Dr. Mathers printed the page, whatever this is. It's wrong. Let me know if you need a formal statement. Back home." I dug through the pile of mail on the hallway sideboard. Most were junk flyers, coupons, credit card offers. But tucked between an old water bill and a gardening catalog was a white envelope with no stamp. Just a printed label, Wepner Household. Inside was a return receipt for a property insurance adjustment. My name was nowhere on it. They weren't just moving things anymore. They were moving me out of signatures, out of reach, out of existence. I called Rudy from the landline and asked to meet. We sat at the diner off Route 26, where they still serve coffee that burns and pie that doesn't. I laid everything out on the table: bank statements, fake filings, the unsigned medical note. Rudy's face went from curious to grim. "If they're getting ready to declare you incompetent," he said, "you have to act now. This is coordinated." We got to work. Drafted a notarized rebuttal to the guardianship assumption, filed an emergency hold on all joint bank access, began a revision of my will. "I'll call a forensic handwriting analyst," Rudy said. "We'll build a defense before there's an accusation." I drove home in silence, fingers tight around the wheel. The hills of Terra Alta rolled out on either side, unchanged for decades, unlike the family I returned to. That night, Ellie knocked on my door. I opened it without speaking. "Mom says you're acting paranoid again," she said softly. "She's worried." I looked at her. "If I really lose my mind, will you be the one who notices or the one who profits. Her face fell. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then maybe listen, I said. Before it's too late. She left. No argument, no defense. And at 3:00 a.m., my phone lit up. Remote account access attempt blocked. Joint account 3329. The next morning, I packed the original deed in a brown envelope, addressed it to Rudy, and drove before anyone else awoke. The air outside was still, but I could feel the dust of something stirring deeper than wind. Later that afternoon, I returned through the back entrance. As I set my keys down, something in the living room caught my eye. The frame that had held Elizabeth's wedding photo, our wedding photo, was gone. In its place, above the mantel, hung a blown-up canvas of Charla, Jory, and Ellie at the beach, wind in their hair, fake laughter on their faces. No one had asked. No one had explained. I went to the storage closet under the stairs. The photo wasn't neatly placed or wrapped. I found it curled beneath a musty tarp, frame cracked at the corner, one edge splintered like someone had stepped on it without care. I picked it up gently, dust catching in my throat. It's not just space they're erasing. It's memory. Mine. Hers. Ours. Later that evening, I stepped outside to take the trash bin down to the curb. As I turned, something caught the corner of my eye, a small white sign stuck just behind the azalea bush, angled toward the road. For sale by owner. I moved quickly. It was real. Real wood. Printed plastic. I flipped it over. On the back was a sticker, priority closing available. My hands trembled, not with age, but with fury. I yanked it from the ground and stuffed it behind the shed, out of sight. When I returned inside, my jaw was tight, my shoulders burned. That night at dinner, I waited until the conversation hit one of its usual shallow lulls. Then I said, evenly, I found a for sale sign by the mailbox. Charla didn't look up from her plate, probably drifted over from the neighbor's yard, she said, lightly. Jory sipped his drink. Ellie chewed slower. I set down my fork. The neighbor doesn't have our address printed on their signs, or a sticker that says priority closing. Silence. Charla finally met my gaze, eyes syrup sweet. Maybe you're seeing things again. You've seemed distracted lately. That word again hung in the air like mold. The next morning, I drove through town with no destination, but my gut knew where I'd end up. The real estate office had a window display out front, just off Main Street. Among the listings, a photo caught my eye. My house, my porch, my wife's rose trellis. A flyer clipped underneath coming soon, contact for private showings. I walked in. The receptionist smiled. Can I help you? Yes, I'm Lemuel Beach. That's my house in your window. She blinked. Oh, yes, of course. That listing was submitted by Charla Wepner. I nodded. And who signed the agreement? She turned to her computer. It was submitted digitally. We have a signed form on file. I can print it. Please. She handed it over. It had my name, but the signature looked too smooth, too recent, and I knew I hadn't touched a pen for them in weeks. I never signed this. I said. Her smile faltered. You may want to speak to someone in legal. I'm just front desk. I left without a word, the paper folded in my pocket like a verdict. Back home, I sat at the desk in my room, pulled out a sheet of paper, and wrote a short letter to Rudy. They've prepared the sale. I have until the end of spring before this house belongs to strangers. I signed it with the old fountain pen Elizabeth had gifted me the year we paid off the mortgage. Then I laid it on the table, beside the folded gardening gloves and the cracked photo frame. These weren't just objects. They were the final witnesses. That night, I lay awake in the dark, no television, no fan, just the soft hum of the house settling or shifting, beneath the floorboards, beneath the facade. And then I heard it, Jory's voice, low and sharp, from downstairs. Let's get him out before May. Quietly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. But in that silence, something hardened. By Friday morning, I'd mailed the signed affidavit to Rudy, sealed with tape, witnessed, notarized, legal. If tonight went where I thought it would, I needed my facts filed and loaded before they tried anything else. Charla knocked on my door at noon. She wore a linen blouse, too pressed for an afternoon, "We're doing dinner tonight," she said. "Something special. Family reset." I looked up from the book I wasn't reading. Special. Like the last one. She smiled as if I'd made a joke. "You'll want to dress nice." I nodded once. Then, as soon as she left, I slipped the recorder into my jacket pocket, checked the battery, and pressed it off. I'd saved the charge for the moment that counted. By 6, the dining room looked like something out of a catalog. Candles in silver holders, napkins folded into fans, Jory in a collared shirt he hadn't worn since his last interview, Ellie placing water glasses in perfect alignment. Her phone tucked face down beside the breadbasket. She mentioned a new brand deal. Kitchen stuff, mostly. She said, retro vibe. I sat down last, listening more than I looked. Charla lifted her glass first. "To new beginnings," she said, "and brave decisions." Jory cleared his throat. "Dad, this isn't easy, but we've been thinking a lot about what's best. For you, for all of us." He picked up a sheet of paper, the kind that prints from an office with no soul. "We believe transitioning into a care facility would provide the structure and safety you deserve." I didn't blink, didn't flinch, just watched them like strangers at my own table. "Of course," Charla added, "we'll visit. Weekly. Maybe more." I looked down at my plate, still warm. "So this dinner," I said, "was to sell me a future in a place I never chose." Charla leaned forward. "You don't get to decide anymore. You're barely here." The air sucked itself out of the room. "Yet somehow," I said, "I'm still funding all your failures." Jory's head jerked up. Charla's smile cracked. "Shut up. Widower." The word split the air like a slap. Ellie gasped. Jory dropped his napkin. I stood slowly, adjusted the sleeves of my jacket. "Well," I said, "thank you for confirming everything I needed. That'll be all." I left the room. Nobody followed. Upstairs, I connected the recorder to my computer, transferred the file, made 3 backups, one for Rudy, one for the safe, one for the cloud. The last time they twisted my words would be the last. That night, I slept light, if at all. Their voices haunted the hallway. Even the walls seemed embarrassed. By morning, I had my suitcase zipped, one change of clothes, one folder of originals, one framed photo Elizabeth in the garden. As I lifted the handle, a knock sounded. Ellie. She stood there in pajama pants and mascara from last night. "Grandpa." I didn't mean to let it go that far. I looked at her, long and level. "Then maybe next time." I said, "Don't stay silent when it matters." I woke before the sun and dressed without turning on a light. The house was quiet, like it always was after a storm. I folded 2 shirts, one pair of pants, my shaving kit, and Elizabeth's photo into a small suitcase. Nothing more. I left a printed letter on the kitchen table, where the remains of last night's dinner still sat untouched. "Thank you," it read, "for making this decision easy." As I rolled the suitcase down the hallway, I didn't glance at the walls, None of them had stories left I wanted to remember. Not anymore. I built this house with my own hands, but it didn't know me anymore. The drive into town was quiet. Birds cut the air above the road, and I kept the radio off. Rudy's office light was already on. I stepped inside without knocking. He looked up, saw the look on my face, and didn't say a word, just motioned me in. I placed the deed, the USB, and Elizabeth's frame on his desk. They tried to move me out of my own life. I said, "We reviewed everything again, slow and deliberate. Rudy was thorough. You're doing this while you're still clear and strong," he said, watching me sign the new will. "That's your legacy now." We struck Jory, Charla, and Ellie from every document, replaced with a list of institutions, foundations, and a few old friends who had never once asked for a dime. I headed straight from Rudy's to the Community Builders Foundation. They'd helped veterans reclaim homes in worse shape than mine. The director, a woman in her 60s named Glenna, looked surprised when I told her I wanted to donate the house. "It's yours, Mr. Beach," she said cautiously. I nodded. "Not anymore. Let it shelter someone who still remembers what it means." Later that afternoon, I sat in the motel off Route 55, modest, clean, anonymous. I placed Elizabeth's photo beside the bedside lamp, just like I used to when we traveled. And then, without planning to, I drifted back. Our 45th anniversary. The backyard lit with strings of soft yellow lights. Elizabeth laughing in a pale blue dress. Her fingers looped through mine as we danced barefoot on the grass. We had a cheap speaker playing from the kitchen window and grilled hot dogs over a rusted pit. Nothing fancy, just us, just joy. "We started over with less," I whispered aloud. That night, I wrote the last letter I would ever address to that house. I folded the will copy, slid in a letter with one simple message, and sealed the envelope. "You will no longer be able to reach me. This is not revenge. It is relief." I woke early again the next morning and walked to the mailbox. No one else was up. I placed the envelope inside, shut the lid, and didn't look back. The air was cool, tinged with spring. I took the first full breath in weeks. It felt like mine. I had only my suitcase, the folder Rudy gave me, and Elizabeth's photo. That's all I needed. No accusations, no farewells, just steps forward. The motel bed creaked as I sat back down, expecting silence, but my phone buzzed once. A voicemail. Ellie's voice trembled through the speaker. I read the letter. "Grandpa, I don't know who I am anymore." The light coming through the blinds in my small new room was gentler than I remembered, maybe because no one had shouted beneath it. I sat up slowly, my knees cracking like old wood. The mattress wasn't much, but it held me. Across the room, a neat row of pots lined the windowsill: basil, mint, rosemary. Mrs. Vaughn next door had brought them over the day I moved in. "Something green for your hands," she'd said. It had been years since anyone gave me something without wanting something back. I watered the soil with measured care, watching the drops soak in. No one would touch these but me. That was freedom. And for now, it was enough. Rudy's call came just after I finished breakfast: instant oats. No garnish. "It's done," he said. "The house is no longer yours. It belongs to the foundation now, permanently." I waited. Charla filed for an injunction last week. Judge denied it. Not enough grounds. I didn't smile. I just exhaled. "Thank you," he added. "You've sealed your name with intent. They can't drag it anymore. Not legally." There was a pause. Then, softer. "You did the right thing, Lem." By noon, Ellie arrived. She didn't buzz, just knocked gently. Her face had less edge now, more weight behind the eyes. I know I shouldn't be here, she started, but I needed to see you. I stepped aside. We sat on the small bench near the plants. Mom cries. A lot. Dad's just somewhere else most of the time, like the house finally folded without you in it. I listened. No judgment. Just wine passing through an open window. I didn't stop any of it. That's what eats me up, she added. You didn't push it either. I said. She looked down. Can I visit again? Maybe. Help with these. She nodded toward the herbs. Only if it's you that shows up. I said, not their messenger. She nodded again. This time, slower. We didn't hug, but the silence held us close. Later that evening, I sorted mail. Among the bills and ads, I found one familiar envelope, my handwriting on it, postmarked, weeks ago. Returned unopened. I slid it open carefully, hands trembling. Inside, Elizabeth's photograph and a note I had written during a darker day, "You will not erase us." I placed the photo upright on my modest bookshelf, right between a volume of Steinbeck and a Bible. She fit there, always had. That night, I recorded a voice message, my final one. I'm not angry. Not anymore. This isn't revenge. It's restoration. I don't hate you, but I don't belong to you anymore. I passed it to Rudy the next morning, to be delivered when all was settled. The air that night was cooler. I took my tea to the balcony. The sun dipped behind the hills, turning the sky into layers of copper and ash. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for tomorrow. The phone buzzed once more. Rudy again. She wants to meet Charla. Says it's not about the house. I didn't answer immediately. I just watched the last light drop behind the trees. I'll think about it, I said, already knowing I wouldn't. The knock came just after 9. I was watching dust spin in a sunbeam over my windowsill basil when the sound cracked through the quiet. I opened the door to Charla, standing like someone who'd rehearsed her breath. She held a folder, her hands too tight around it. I didn't come for the house, she said. We sat outside on the patio. I poured 2 cups of weak tea. The wind flicked the steam sideways. Charla stared at her cup like it might say something she couldn't. When she finally spoke, her voice frayed at the edges. We failed you. I failed you. I don't know how to fix it. I stirred my tea but didn't sip it. You don't fix betrayal. You choose who you are after it. She reached into her bag, pulling out a sealed envelope. This is financial documentation and a draft letter to the foundation. If you want to include it in your files. I nodded. No forgiveness. But I didn't close the door when she left. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Ellie. Her voice was softer than I'd heard in months. I'm moving out. Got a cafe job in Pittsburgh. I don't want to live like them anymore. I pressed the phone closer. Then live like you. There was a pause. Maybe one day. You'll come taste what I make. Maybe I will, I said, meaning it. The next day, I met Rudy again. He looked up from his desk and smiled. That story about the vet foundation. It's gaining traction. Local press is circling. I frowned. I didn't do any of this for headlines. He nodded. You didn't. That's why it matters. I didn't answer. But something inside me, a quiet part, loosened. 2 mornings later, I drove to Terra Alta. The house stood different, emptier, even though nothing had changed structurally. A chain-link fence hugged the yard. A sold sign tilted slightly in the grass. I parked down the block and walked up the sidewalk I'd poured with my own hands 40 years ago. Near the apple tree, one stubborn blossom clung to a low branch. I picked it, stepped to the mailbox, placed the bloom on the metal. No envelope this time, just a bloom. Not for memory, for mercy. That night, back in Morgantown, I sat on my balcony. The wind was gentle, not accusatory. I sipped tea, the real kind this time, and watched the moonlight spill across the street below. Then my phone lit up. A text from an unknown number. Thank you for setting boundaries. Maybe now we can heal. Jory. I read it twice. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. The morning light filtered through slats of the blinds, brushing across the sketch pad on my lap. I'd woken early, as I often did now, not from tension or habit, but because the quiet asked me to. With a pencil dulled just enough to glide gently, I traced the beginnings of a bridge. Not steel, not concrete, just watercolor lines over paper, arcing softly over an imagined creek. It wasn't designed for load capacity. It wouldn't connect cities. This bridge, unlike the ones I built for decades, wasn't made for others. It was just mine. I glanced at the potted thyme on my windowsill, a gift from Mrs. Vaughn across the hall. She'd insisted the herb warded off bad dreams. I hadn't had one since it arrived. Later that morning, Rudy called. His voice was calm, the kind you trust without needing to look someone in the eye. It's official. The house has closed. The foundation's active. And the scholarship program already has its first applicant. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd held. Charla's injunction denied. Judge said there was sufficient proof of clarity and independent will. I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Good. You're clear, Lem, Rudy added, fully, publicly. I turned on the TV, volume low. As the local station aired a segment, my name appeared beneath the anchor's voice. Veteran builder rewrites legacy after family legal battle. There were clips of the old house, now with new banners for the foundation. No interviews, no dramatic reenactments, just facts. I watched it all, then turned it off. That afternoon, Ellie visited again. She didn't bring apologies, and I didn't expect any. What she carried was more honest, a small white box tied with twine. Inside, pastries, her own baking. She set the box down on my kitchen counter, then pulled a chair beside mine on the patio. We sat in easy silence. I'm not asking for the past back, she said finally. Just permission to earn your future. I looked at her, truly looked. There wasn't a hint of her mother's calculation in her, just trembling steadiness. Then, keep showing up like this, I said. She nodded and didn't stay too long. That was part of her change, knowing when to leave without trying to fix things in one sitting. That night, I sifted through old papers, mostly out of routine. One envelope, thick and slightly crumpled, caught my attention. It had my own handwriting on it addressed to me, postmarked 3 weeks ago. I had mailed it during one of the darker days, unsure if I'd even remain where it might return. Inside, a photo of Elizabeth, tucked against a note I barely remembered writing, "You will not erase us." I placed both on the small bookshelf near my bed, standing the photo upright, facing the door, not as a shrine but as a memory set on its feet. The following morning, a letter arrived, unusual in that it bore no return address, but was handwritten in careful strokes I'd taught him myself. Jory, I was raised better. You were right to leave. I'll spend my life earning back what we threw away. I didn't respond, but I didn't throw it out either. I pinned it to the back of my sketchbook, behind the newest design, a bridge that curved across nothing but white space, soft and arched, resting between two imagined hills. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it didn't need to be. That afternoon, I took a walk. Morgantown held its warmth differently than Terra Alta. The streets hummed with a quiet pace, the kind that didn't shove you out of the way. I walked the riverside trail, passing the new spring growth, the smell of honeysuckle and sun-warmed gravel. Just off the path stood the modest pedestrian bridge I'd discovered my first week here. No fanfare, no plaques. It simply spanned a narrow creek, with enough space mid-span for one person to sit. I did just that. I opened the sketchbook on my lap and began tracing what I saw. The way the water bent around the stones, the crooked shadow of a birch tree leaning over, the shape of clouds drifting, unconcerned with names or ownership. A quiet filled the space around me, not silence, exactly, but a peace that came from not needing to explain myself. Voices drifted from a nearby bench, two elderly men playing chess, arguing softly about a bishop's move. A woman jogging with her dog paused to wave. No one here knew what I'd left behind, and no one asked. I placed the sketchbook beside me and looked out over the bridge. Bridges don't just connect places, they create perspective. They span what divides and sometimes what was never meant to connect in the first place. This one didn't carry weight, it carried clarity. I thought of Elizabeth, of the way she'd lean over the counter as I explained blueprints to her, nodding though she never cared about measurements. She'd ask about the people who would cross those bridges, the stories they'd carry. Now, sitting halfway across a quiet span, I wondered what story I was carrying. Not grief, not shame, just choice. I closed the sketchbook, stood up, and brushed the dust from my pants. Before leaving, I pressed a small folded note beneath the bench, a habit from my younger days. It simply said, "If you find this, build something true." As I stepped off the bridge and onto the path again, I felt the sun warm my back. I am not what I lost. I am what I chose to let go.